The first time I saw her, she was sitting under a tree. Not a throne, not a ceremonial dais ringed with advisors and honor guards, not even a bench in some manicured diplomatic garden where important people were supposed to be seen. She was sitting cross-legged in the shade of a tree at the edge of the landing field, her back against the bark, a battered data tablet balanced on one knee, and she was reading. The tree was enormous. That was the first thing I noticed, before I even properly noticed her. It rose from cracked permacrete in tiered horizontal branches, each layer spreading outward like outstretched arms, the whole canopy shaped like a stepped pagoda reaching toward a pale amber sky. Its leaves were broad and dark, deep green above and silver green below, and the lowest branches reached so far out that their shadow covered maybe 30 square meters of ground. Some of the leaves along the outer edges had turned. Not dead, not dying, just changing. A slow blush of copper and red working outward from the leaf tips inward toward the stem, like a fire that refused to rush. I stood at the bottom of the Meridian's ramp and stared at the tree for a full 10 seconds before I remembered. I was supposed to be somewhere important. The Vethani conclave had been running for 6 days before I arrived. 14 planetary delegations, 43 recognized royal bloodlines, one summit protocol that my government had spent 11 months negotiating just to get a chair at. The Vethani didn't need humanity there. We were new, we were small, we had exactly one colony and one cruiser to our name, but they'd offered an observer seat anyway, which my superiors had interpreted as either an olive branch or a trap, and had sent me to figure out which. My name is Reyes, Marcus Reyes, former lieutenant, current diplomatic attaché, permanently underpaid. I had a background in xenolinguistics, a functional knowledge of 4 Vethani trade dialects, and absolutely no idea what I was walking into. The conclave grounds were inside the compound. The compound was behind the landing field. The girl under the tree was between me and the compound gate, and as I walked toward her, I got a better look. She was Vethani. The coloring was right, the bone structure, the secondary eyelid membrane that caught the light when she glanced up at my approaching footsteps. But her clothing wasn't ceremonial. No house sigils, no rank markings, no formal drape. Just a plain working tunic in dull green and a pair of travel trousers that had seen some actual travel. Her hair was loose, which among Vethani nobility was roughly equivalent to a human showing up to a state dinner in a bathrobe. She had a small scar along her jaw, almost hidden by the angle of her chin. And she was, without any visible concern for what anyone thought of her, sitting under a tree reading. She looked up when I was about 5 meters away. Her secondary eyelids flickered, surprise, maybe, or assessment, and then she looked back at her tablet. "You are the human," she said. Her standard was clean, barely accented. "That's one way to put it," I said. "The attaché, Marcus Reyes." She turned a page. "You are 6 hours late. Weather delay on transit station 4. She didn't seem particularly interested in the excuse. The opening ceremonies concluded this morning. The 17th house made an alliance proposal to the 3rd house. The 3rd house declined. There was a formal insult sequence that lasted 40 minutes. You missed all of it. I looked at the compound gate, then back at her, and you didn't. I did miss it, actually. She held up the tablet briefly. I found the archive records more useful. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, "I'm sorry, I don't think I caught your name." She looked up properly then. Something shifted in her expression, not quite amusement, not quite resignation. More like a woman who had explained something many times and had made peace with the fact that she'd have to explain it again. "Sira," she said. "Sira Valenkethi, 23rd house." I ran a quick mental inventory. I'd memorized the participant list. 14 delegations, 43 bloodlines. The Ankethi were, I had to reach for it, a coastal house. Minor title, 1 inhabited moon. They were on the list the way footnotes are on a document, technically present, functionally invisible. 23rd house, I said. Yes. You're here for the conclave. I am technically present for the conclave, she said, which was not quite the same thing, and we both knew it. She went back to reading. I should have kept walking. I had a briefing to collect, a liaison to meet, and 6 hours of lost ground to cover. Instead, I stood there in the shadow of the enormous tiered tree, and I listened to the wind move through its leaves, a sound like dry paper, like the edges of things, and I said, "What are you reading?" She paused. A geological survey of Ankethi moon surface tidal patterns from 300 years ago. For fun. For understanding. She finally set the tablet on her knee and looked at me properly. The current dispute between the 7th and 11th houses involves subsurface mineral rights on a shared orbital body. The legal framework they are arguing from was established 260 years ago, following a survey whose methodology was flawed. No one in that conference room knows this, because no one in that conference room has read the original survey. They are building on a foundation they have never checked. I looked at her for a long moment. "You've told them this?" I asked. "Twice," she said. "And?" She picked the tablet back up. "I came to read under the tree." The Vethani conclave was everything I had expected it to be, which is to say it was ornate, exhausting, and about 60% theater. The main hall was an architectural statement. Vaulted ceilings that caught sound and threw it back at you, floor inlays in the heraldic colors of every major house, seating arranged not by alphabetical order or even by seniority, but by some system of relational precedence that had apparently taken the protocol office 4 months to calculate. My observer's chair was in the second gallery, behind a screen of carved latticework, because that was where observers sat, meaning I could hear everything and see approximately a third of the table. I spent the first afternoon cataloging what I could observe and cross-referencing it against the briefings I'd been given. The 9th house wanted trade route concessions. The 2nd house wanted a defense pact. The 5th house wanted to relitigate a marriage alliance from 80 years ago that had, apparently, gone sideways in some spectacularly complicated fashion that no one was willing to explain plainly. The chairman, a senior representative of the 1st house, whose name I kept mispronouncing in my head, moved through the agenda with the careful efficiency of someone defusing a bomb they'd built themselves. And through all of it, the 23rd house said nothing. I watched the delegation from the 23rd. There were 3 of them, an elderly advisor who appeared to be asleep for much of the first session, a younger aide who took extremely precise notes, and Sira Val Ankethi, who sat very still, listened to everything, and occasionally wrote something on a small card that she folded and tucked into her tunic. On the 2nd day, I found her under the tree again at the end of the afternoon session. "You took notes," I said, sitting down on a root near her. It was wide enough to serve as a bench. She didn't look up. "I always take notes." "On cards." "Paper holds information in a power outage." "When was the last time a diplomatic compound lost power?" 11 years ago, the Rathavi Summit. House Kalaneth lost 3 days of digital records. The dispute they were mediating is still unresolved. She glanced sideways at me. I looked it up. I sat with that for a second. "The thing you said yesterday," I said, "about the mineral rights survey, the flawed methodology." "Yes." "Can I read it, the original survey?" She did look up then. Something different crossed her face this time, careful, I thought, like she was checking something for structural integrity before committing her weight to it. "Why?" she asked. "Because you're right that nobody in that room has checked the foundation, and I'm an observer. I have no position to defend, no alliance to protect. I'm genuinely just, I spread my hands here to understand." Another pause. Then she reached into her bag, extracted a second data chip, and handed it across. "The annotation file is mine," she said. "Not official, treated accordingly." I read the survey that night in my quarters. It took 4 hours. Her annotations were meticulous, quiet, precise. No dramatic corrections, no "look what I found" fanfare, just careful marginal notes in a small, clear script that walked you through exactly where the original researchers had made their assumptions, and exactly where those assumptions had diverged from the evidence. By the end, I understood the mineral rights dispute 3 times better than I had, and I had also begun to understand something about Sierra, Val, and Kethy that the conclave room could not have shown me. She wasn't quiet because she had nothing to say. She was quiet because she had learned that the room wasn't listening. The conclave's 3rd day brought the first genuine crisis. It started, as most crises do, with something that looked like a smaller thing. The 6th house made a procedural challenge to the 12th house's documentation of a long-standing resource agreement. The 12th house responded with a counter-challenge. The 1st house's chairman attempted to table the issue until the 4th day. The 6th house took offense at the tabling. The 12th house took offense at the 6th house taking offense. Within approximately 90 minutes, 4 additional houses had chosen sides, 3 of which had chosen sides that directly contradicted their earlier stated positions, and the chairman was beginning to look like a man who had found a small fire in the kitchen and now stood watching the ceiling. I was in the second gallery taking notes when I noticed Sierra was also taking notes. Very fast notes. Her head was down, her pen moving, and the aide beside her was watching her with an expression that I couldn't quite read through the lattice. At the recess, declared somewhat desperately by the chairman after the 9th house delivered what my translation suggested was a legally specific but personally pointed accusation at the 6th house. I went down to the ground floor and waited near the side corridor I'd seen her use. She came out fast, head still bent over her notes, nearly walked into me. "There's a procedural exit," I said. "I know there's a procedural exit." The resource documentation at the center of the 6/12 dispute was filed under the wrong classification framework in the first place, she said, not slowing her pace. The original agreement was a humanitarian provision, not a commercial one. It was cross-filed incorrectly 30 years ago, and no one caught it because the classification change happened during a period of administrative reform, and the index was not retroactively updated. If you apply the correct classification, the 6th house's challenge has no standing. I walked beside her. "You've already found this." "3 days ago." "Have you told anyone?" She stopped walking. We were in a side passage between the main hall and the smaller committee rooms, alone except for a wall of windows looking out over the compound grounds. The Ketapang tree was visible at an angle, its broad tiered canopy catching the afternoon light. "I submitted a written brief to the chair's office on the morning of the 2nd day," she said. Her voice was even. Very even in a way that people make their voices when they are practicing not showing something. It was acknowledged. It was not read into the record. It was not raised by the chair. It was not, as far as I can determine, acted upon. I looked at her. "Why not?" "Because it came from the 23rd house." She said it simply, not bitterly, not with the self-pity of someone seeking validation, just simply, the way you'd state a fact about gravity. "The 23rd house has no major trade partnerships. We have no military alliance value. We have no sitting relatives on any of the senior house's councils. We are here because the protocol requires all recognized houses above a certain threshold to be invited, and we are, just barely, above that threshold. Nothing we say moves the agenda." "Except that you're right," I said. "Being right does not move the agenda," she said. "Being powerful moves the agenda." She started walking again. I fell into step beside her. "What would happen," I said, "if someone powerful raised it?" She stopped again. This time she turned and looked at me fully, the secondary eyelids still, the primary gaze direct and measuring. "The human attaché," she said, "has no power here either." No, but I have something you don't. Which is? They have no idea what I want, I said. I don't have an alliance to protect or a trade route to defend. I have no history with any of them. I'm an observer. I can ask questions that any of them would be politically unable to ask, because the asking wouldn't cost me anything, and the answer would cost them everything to avoid. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the tree's high canopy, dry paper sound, the turning of old things. If you raise this in session, she said carefully, they will investigate why, and they will find the original brief, and it will come back to the 23rd house. Yes. And they will not be pleased. Probably not. You would do this, she said, not a question exactly, more like she was testing the sentence to see if it felt true. I'd like to read your brief first, I said. If it holds up, and I think it will, yes. She reached into her tunic and produced a folded card. It was already written. She had prepared it before the conversation, I realized. She had known or suspected that this conversation would happen. She had been ready. It holds up, she said, and she walked away toward the committee rooms, and I stood in the side passage holding a folded card, and through the window the ketapang tree shed one red leaf in a slow spiral to the ground. The afternoon session reconvened with all the suppressed tension of a room full of people who had spent recess being very diplomatic at each other. I waited until the chairman made his opening statement, and then I raised the observer's inquiry flag, a small procedural mechanism that technically existed to allow non-member parties to seek clarification, used approximately never because observers were supposed to observe, not participate. The chairman looked at the flag with the expression of a man who had not expected this particular problem today. The attaché from the human delegation, he said. Thank you, Chair, I stood. I have a point of clarification regarding the documentation at the center of the current dispute, specifically regarding the classification framework under which the original resource agreement was filed. The room was quiet in a very specific way. The kind of quiet that isn't silence but is everyone choosing, simultaneously, not to be the one who speaks first. I laid it out the way Sierra's brief laid it out, simply, without accusation, without theater, just the chain of documentation, the original agreement's humanitarian framing, the administrative reclassification event 30 years ago, the index gap, the resulting mismatch between what the document said it was and what it actually was. I cited the reference numbers. I cited the dates. I read from the brief in my hand without telling them whose brief it was. When I finished, the room was doing that thing where it's very loud without anyone speaking. The Sixth House's senior representative said, carefully, "Where did the attaché obtain this analysis?" "From the Public Documentation Archive," I said, "which has been available to this conclave for its entire duration." It was technically true. The survey data was public. Sierra had found it there. The analysis was hers, but I wasn't lying about where the information lived. The chairman called for a recess. The brief was verified. It took the documentation committee 4 hours, which meant it was finished well after the day's official session had ended, and the verification was quiet. A formal notation added to the record, not announced, not dramatized. But it was there. The Sixth House's challenge lost standing. The dispute, which had been escalating toward a potential fracture of the conclave's entire lower agenda, was resolved with something close to anticlimax. I found Sierra under the tree, just before the compound lights shifted to evening mode. She was not reading. She was sitting with her back against the bark, knees drawn up, watching the sky do what the sky did here at this hour, a slow gradient from amber to a deep violet that the clouds caught and held in long horizontal bands. I sat on the root again. "It worked," I said. "I know. My aide monitors the committee feeds. The Sixth House is going to figure out eventually that the brief came from you." "Yes," she tilted her head back against the bark. The chair's secretary came to find me an hour ago, unofficially, to express regret that the written brief had not been actioned more promptly. That's a very diplomatic way to say sorry. It's a very diplomatic way to say they noticed. The tree made its paper leaf sound above us. I looked up into the canopy. Some of the higher leaves were catching the last horizontal light and burning copper. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "You've already asked me many things." "One more." She made a small gesture with one hand. "Go ahead." "The brief was ready," I said. "Before the conversation, you already had it written out. You were waiting." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm always waiting," she said. "I have 18 briefs currently prepared for situations the conclave has not yet encountered. I will prepare more as the week continues. Most of them will not be used. Some of them will be used but not attributed. A few of them, eventually, might be read by someone in a position to act on them, and when that happens things will improve slightly, for a while, for some people. That doesn't bother you, the not being attributed." She thought about that for longer than I expected. "The tree does not require attribution," she said, "to provide shade." I looked at the tree. It was a ridiculous thing to say. It was also precisely right in a way that I couldn't argue with and didn't want to. "You know," I said, "where I'm from there's a version of diplomacy that's not like this. Not all of it anyway. Some of it is exactly like this, the theater, the posturing, the careful insults. But some of it is this." I nodded at the folded card I'd set on the route between us, reading the survey, checking the foundation, asking the question nobody powerful enough to ask it would bother to ask. "And does it work?" she asked, "where you're from?" "Sometimes," I said. "It worked today." She looked at me sideways. The secondary eyelids did the thing they did when she was thinking something she hadn't decided whether to say. "You are a strange diplomat," she said. "I'm a very inexperienced one," I said. "Maybe that's the same thing." "No," she said. "Experience usually makes people stop checking foundations. You have not yet learned to assume you already know what is there." The compound lights shifted, casting long blue shadows across the landing field. Somewhere in the distance, the formal evening events were beginning, the dinner gatherings, the informal negotiations conducted over food and social lubrication. I should have been at one of them. I was sitting on a tree root. "I'll be going back eventually," I said, "to Earth, or to the colony, or wherever they send me next." "Yes," she said, "you will. But I'll be here for the rest of the conclave, 10 more days. 11, she said. "There will be an extension. The 7th-11th mineral dispute will require additional mediation once the false foundation of the previous survey is formally acknowledged. I've drafted a proposed mediation framework." She paused. "It's in the bag." I almost laughed. It wasn't quite a laugh, more like the thing that lives right next to a laugh. "Of course it is," I said. "On the 5th day, I made a mistake. It wasn't a large mistake in the cosmic sense. No alliances shattered, no wars declared, but in the particular ecosystem of a diplomatic conclave, it was the kind of mistake that announces itself like a sound in a quiet room. I asked the wrong question in session. Not a procedural question, not a clarifying inquiry. I framed it as a challenge, inadvertently, because I was reading a brief in my head while also tracking a secondary exchange between the 9th and 2nd houses, and the 2 threads crossed in my mouth before I'd checked the output. The 3rd house representative's expression didn't change. That was how I knew it was bad. When someone in that kind of room doesn't react, they're controlling the reaction, which means there was one to control. I flagged it in my notebook. Wrong register, wrong moment. I'd essentially implied, without meaning to, that the 3rd house's documentation was incomplete. It wasn't, or rather it was, but not in the way I'd implied, and more importantly the implication had come out sideways rather than factual. The session ended 40 minutes later. I went to the side corridor. Sira was already there. You heard, I said. I monitor the session feeds, she said, real time. The third house will not hold it against you past the end of the day, she said, before I could finish the sentence. The third house representative is Senior Prefect Valenti. She has been doing this for 31 years. She has heard far more pointed challenges from people who meant them, and she is not the kind of person who nurses grievances against accidental implication. She paused. She is, however, the kind of person who will now look at you differently. More carefully, I said. Yes, she will assume that the mistake was deliberate, a probe, not an error. People in these rooms do not accept the existence of genuine accidents easily. So she'll think I was testing her. She'll think you were doing something intentional and miscalculated the execution. Sira tilted her head slightly, which means she'll try to figure out what you were actually after. Which means she'll be paying attention to the observer's flag from now on. I let that settle. That's not entirely bad. No, it's not entirely bad. She reached into her bag. I have a brief on the third house's documentation that might be relevant if she approaches you. Not a confrontation, a clarification. Something you could produce as if you'd been researching it independently. She handed me a folded card. I looked at it, then I looked at her. You prepared this before the session, I said. I prepare things before they are needed, she said. That is the nature of preparation. Did you know I was going to make that mistake? No. But I knew the 9th-second exchange would pull your attention at approximately that moment in the agenda, and I know that divided attention produces unintended outputs, and I know the third house's documentation has a vulnerability that would surface naturally if someone were half paying attention to it. She paused. I prepared the brief because the vulnerability existed, not because I predicted your error. But you weren't surprised. She considered this. I was mildly surprised. I expected it from the 11th house's delegate who has been visibly frustrated with the third house for 3 days, not from you. I flatter myself. You read more carefully than the 11th house's delegate. He reads to confirm what he already believes. You read to find out. She closed her bag. That is why I gave you the chip. I held the folded card for a moment. Sira. Yes. How long has the 23rd house been preparing briefs that no one reads? She was quiet for long enough that I thought she might not answer. Since before I was born, she said finally. My mother prepared them, her mother before her. The house has records going back 4 generations, research archives, documentation files, analysis notes on conclave proceedings, resource agreements, treaty structures. 4 generations of careful work, compiled and cross-referenced and updated. She made a small movement with her hand that was not quite a gesture, more like a word she decided not to say. Kept. Kept, I said. Kept read by us, referenced in our own decisions. Shared when sharing was possible, which was rarely, because sharing requires someone to receive, and the great houses have rarely needed anything from a minor house with 1 inhabited moon and no military value. She looked at me steadily. The work was worth doing regardless. The understanding was worth having regardless. But... She stopped. But, I said. I am 32 years old, she said. I have been attending conclaves since I was 19. I have watched this pattern repeat itself. I have told myself it does not matter, that the work has value independent of its recognition, and I believe that. I genuinely believe it. A pause. I also believe that I am very tired. The admission landed quietly, the way quiet things land without drama, but with weight. I think, I said carefully, that the tired and the genuine belief can both be true at the same time. She looked at me. You are not what I expected of a human diplomat. What did you expect? Something louder. She picked up her bag. Your species has a reputation. For loudness. For declaration. Humans announce themselves. Humans make entrances. Humans have a high statistical rate of being memorable even in negative contexts. She paused. You came in 6 hours late and sat on a tree root. I get motion sick on certain transit configurations, I said. I was less memorable than I intended. The corner of her mouth moved. I had been watching that corner of her mouth for 5 days, and it was becoming one of my primary indicators of how a conversation was going. Sit with me for a moment, she said, and moved toward the window that looked out over the compound grounds. We stood at the window for a few minutes. From this angle you could see the full span of the tree's canopy, the tiered pagoda structure of it, each layer of branches reaching outward, the whole shape of it like a held breath or a deliberate patience. The afternoon light was hitting it at an angle that turned every reddening leaf to copper foil, and the ones that had already fallen lay in overlapping circles on the cracked permacrete below, like the rings of something growing. My grandmother told me that her grandmother planted the tree in our village, Sira said, the one I told you about. She said her grandmother brought the seed from a coastal plain 3 days' journey away because she had seen the trees there and wanted one. She said her grandmother told her, plant something that will outlive your grievances. Plant something that does not care who is watching. The tree outside the window moved in a slow current of wind. Does the one here know how old it is? I asked. The conclave tree. Older than the compound, she said. They built around it. There are records of the construction documents specifying that the landing field layout should accommodate an existing Terminalia catappa of significant age. The compound was placed to the north, so the tree would remain in unobstructed ground. She glanced sideways at me. I found this in the Historical Archive Index. Recreationally, I said. The night before the conclave began, she said, I arrived 4 days early. The 9th day brought the most complicated morning. An informal gathering of the 7th, 11th, and 14th houses had been underway for 2 hours before Sira's aide flagged it to her. What they were about to decide was a preliminary agreement on the orbital body dispute that, if formalized, would lock in a cost allocation formula that the 14th house had every reason to accept on its face and no reason to question deeply, because no one had checked the formula's underlying assumption about the body's resource density. The assumption was wrong, not by a little. I found out about it when Sira appeared at the door of my quarters at what I could only describe as an urgent hour of the morning, a document chip in her hand, her expression controlled in the specific way of someone who is controlled because the alternative is panic. Resource density survey, she said, without preamble. 14th house is about to sign onto an allocation formula built on a survey from 60 years ago. The survey methodology was sound, but the survey area was not representative. They sampled the accessible surface deposits and extrapolated to the full body. The actual distribution is significantly uneven. I have the corrective data. It changes the formula substantially. How substantially? The 14th house would receive 63% of what they believe they are agreeing to over the first 20 years. I was now fully awake. They're in that room right now. They have been for 2 hours. The refreshment phase ended approximately 20 minutes ago, which means they are in the drafting phase. If they sign a preliminary agreement, reopening it requires a formal challenge that would damage the 14th house's relationship with both the 7th and 11th houses significantly. She held out the chip. 30 minutes, maybe less. Observer inquiry. Too slow. Formal procedure requires the chair to convene. The chair is not in the building. Committee room access. You are an observer delegate. You technically have access to all non-sealed spaces. Is the room sealed? Not formally. The gathering is informal. I was already dressed. I took the chip. What do I say? That you have a document relevant to the discussion, that you request 60 seconds to present it. She paused. Then you present it. You're not coming. The 23rd house has no standing in this particular discussion. And the human observer does. The human observer has nothing to lose by interrupting and nothing to gain by silence. She met my eyes. Go. I went. The committee room was on the third corridor of the eastern wing. I moved fast through halls quiet at this hour. A maintenance worker with a floor cleaning unit stopped to watch me pass with the expression of someone wondering if this was going to become their problem. The room's door was unmarked but not locked. I opened it and stepped in. 7 people around a table, food arranged at one end, mostly untouched, documents spread across the surface in the organized scatter of active work. The 7th house representative looked up first. "The human attaché," she said. "I apologize for the interruption," I said. "I have a document I believe is directly relevant to the current discussion. I would not interrupt informal proceedings without significant cause. I'm requesting 60 seconds to present a single piece of evidence." The room exchanged the kind of look that rooms exchange when deciding whether to throw someone out. The 14th House's senior delegate said, "The resource allocation agreement." "Yes," I said. He sat back. It wasn't quite permission. It was close enough. I laid out the corrective data the same way I'd laid out everything else that week, simply, without accusation, without theater. The survey from 60 years ago. The methodology sound, I said that clearly, no blame anywhere. The sampling area and what it covered, what it didn't cover, the actual distribution pattern and what it implied for the formula on the table. When I finished, the room was quiet for 5 seconds. Then the 7th House representative said, quietly, "Where did this come from?" "The Regional Geological Archive," I said. "Sector 12, Subindex 4. She looked at the chip I'd set on the table. Then she said, to the room in general, "We should verify this before proceeding." The 14th House delegate was already reaching for the chip. Verification took 4 hours. The agreement was tabled. The formula was revised by a committee that spent 2 days working through the corrective data before producing a new allocation model. I sat under the tree that afternoon with Sira, who had been awake since before the sun rose and had probably not eaten since the previous day's midday meal. I brought food from the communal area. She ate with the practical focus of someone refueling. "You got there in time," she said. 30 seconds to spare, approximately. The 7th House representative. She stopped everything the moment I said resource allocation. I settled on the route. She already had doubts. She always has doubts. She has been doing this for 31 years. Sira set down her food for a moment. She is one of the finest analytical minds at this conclave. She doubted the formula but did not have the evidence to challenge it without exposing herself to counterargument. She needed someone else to walk it in. She needed someone else to carry the weight of the interruption. Sira picked up her food again. The social cost of disrupting informal proceedings. The reputational risk of being wrong. You carried that. She could receive it. I thought about that. I was never going to be wrong, though. The data was solid. "You didn't know that when you knocked on the door." I paused. "No, I didn't." She looked at me with the expression she had when she was deciding whether to say the thing she was thinking. "That was genuinely courageous," she said. It was said quietly, without flourish, the way she said everything, which meant it landed with full weight. "I had good information," I said. "Everyone at this conclave has access to the same information," she said. "The difference is not the information. The difference is what you are willing to do when you have it." The tree above us was losing leaves more quickly now. Something in the light had changed over the past few days, some quality of the season that the tree registered before anything else did. The canopy was still full, still broad, still casting its wide, tiered shade. But the red ones were falling every few minutes now, slow spirals, patient releases, each one landing without ceremony on the ground below. I want to ask you something, Sira said, and I want you to answer honestly, not diplomatically. I'll try, I said, which was the honest answer. Why are you here? Not at this conclave, in this work, human diplomatic service. You do not present as someone who wanted this for the usual reasons. The languages, I said, I find them, the structures of them, how different species build meaning differently. What the grammar assumes about the universe. I paused. I learned my first Vethani trade dialect from a recording archive that was 600 hours long. I did it in 3 months, not because anyone asked me to, because I wanted to know how it worked. She was quiet. And then, I said, the more dialects I learned, the more I found that the meaning under the grammar was often the same. Different structures, same reaching, same trying to say, here is what I see, here is what I need, here is what I'm afraid of, here is what I hope for. I stopped. That's probably not a normal reason. No, she said, but it's a true one. We sat with that for a while. The compound was settling into its late afternoon rhythm around us, the muted sounds of delegations preparing for the evening, voices in distant corridors, the occasional footstep on the permacrete. No one came near the tree. Can I ask you something in return? I said. Yes. The cards, the ones you write notes on during sessions. What about them? You fold them and put them in your tunic, but you also keep them. I've seen you file them at the end of each day. What are they for, exactly? You already have a complete digital record. She looked down at the bag beside her. After a moment she opened it and produced one of the cards, a different one, not a brief, smaller. She handed it across. I unfolded it. Inside, in her small, clear script, was a single line. On the 4th day, the 9th house delegate touched his left temple twice before responding to the 2nd house proposal. Indicates reconsideration, not public position. I track behavior, she said. Nonverbal patterns. Indicators of private uncertainty or private confidence that don't appear in the formal record. Over multiple conclaves with enough data, you can build a model of how each delegate actually thinks, not what they say, but what the body says under the formality. I looked at the card, then at her. How many conclaves have you attended? 6 full conclaves, 11 regional summits, 4 treaty review sessions. And you have cards from all of them. I have an indexed archive, she said, with a faint quality of understatement that suggested the archive was not small. The 9th house delegate, I said, left temple twice, reconsideration. He's been reconsidering the 2nd house proposal since the 3rd day, she said. He will shift his position before the end of the conclave. The 2nd house does not know this yet. When they do, it will change the dynamic of the trade route discussion significantly. I looked at the card again, at the tree, at the fallen leaves. You've been building this, I said. Not just the briefs, not just the surveys, the whole picture, for 13 years. I have been building it, she said. Yes. And you came here with all of it, all that knowledge, all that preparation, and you sat under a tree. And I waited, she said, for someone to ask what I was reading. The next 11 days of the conclave were the most interesting 11 days of my professional life, which was saying something because I had also once been present for a tidal surge emergency on the colony that had involved 3 days of improvised engineering and a very creative use of cargo cabling. I became, in effect, Sira Val Anketha's voice to the room. Not her only voice, she spoke when she could, was occasionally heard when the phrasing was right or the moment was quiet enough. But the mechanism we'd found, observer inquiry, the procedural flag, the question no one with alliances to protect could afford to ask, proved repeatable. She would identify the structural problem. She would document it. She would find the moment to hand it across. I would walk it into the record from a direction no one expected. I want to be precise about something. I was not the clever one in this arrangement. I was the door. The second thing I raised was a proposed resource-sharing formula that, as Sierra had noted 3 days before anyone else thought to look, contained a mathematical error in the unit conversion that would cause the 14th house to receive approximately 40% less than the agreed distribution over a 10-year period. Not a deliberate cheat. She was fairly certain it wasn't. She traced the error to a transcription mistake in the committee's draft, but significant enough that its uncorrection would become a grievance within 5 years. The third thing I raised was a historical precedent from a conclave 40 years prior that reframed an otherwise deadlocked territorial question in a way that gave both sides a plausible face-saving exit. Sierra had found it in an archive index marked Miscellaneous Proceedings, Regional Convocations. She'd been looking through it on the third evening, after dinner, apparently for recreational purposes. "You read archive indexes recreationally," I'd said. "I find them calming," she'd said, with the perfect sincerity of someone who genuinely meant it. The fourth house's senior representative stopped me in the corridor on the 7th day. He was a large man, large by Vithani standards, which made him very large, with house sigils worked in silver thread on a tunic that probably cost more than my annual stipend. He had the particular stillness of someone who was important and knew it without needing to announce it. "The human attaché," he said. "The fourth house," I said. He looked at me for a moment, a professional look, the kind that's taking measurements. "You have been useful to this conclave," he said, "more useful than observer delegations typically are." "I've just been asking clarifying questions," I said. "You have been asking clarifying questions that none of us could ask without signaling position," he said. "Which is not the same thing." Another pause. "The documentation on the 7th-11th mediation framework that was proposed this morning, where does the human attaché access this quality of analysis?" I'd been waiting for this. "I read a lot of archives," I said. He looked at me for another moment, and I had the impression he was a man who had been doing this long enough to know what I meant by that, even though I hadn't said it. "The 23rd house," he said, "has been underutilized in these proceedings." "The 23rd house," I said, "has good archives." He made a sound that might have been amusement, in the Vithani way that doesn't look exactly like amusement. "An interesting delegation," he said, and walked away. I went and found Sierra under the tree. It was late morning. She'd skipped the first half of the session to finish a cross-referencing project she'd started the night before. "The fourth house knows," I said, sitting on the root. "I expected that by day 6, so we're a day behind my estimate," she said. "What did he say?" "That you've been underutilized." She was quiet for a moment. The tree moved above us. One of its leaves turned fully red, the color of old brick, the color of deep water at dusk, released from its branch and fell in a long, slow spiral, catching 2 different drafts on the way down, and landed on the root between us. She picked it up, turned it over. The underside was pale, almost silver. "This tree," she said, "sheds its leaves twice a year, both seasons. They turn red first, then fall, and then new ones grow. The Vithani word for this is not the same word as dying. There is a separate word which means releasing in order to be ready." She set the leaf back on the root. "I have been with the 23rd house all my life," she said. "There are 4 of us, including the elderly advisor who, I should mention, is not asleep during sessions. He has a condition that affects his eyelid control, and he has decided he does not wish to explain it to anyone." A small pause. "He is one of the sharpest analysts I know. He has been with the house for 50 years. He has seen 17 conclaves. He should be here at the table. He would say he is where he is supposed to be." She looked up into the canopy. "My house is old. It was not always small. 3 generations ago, Ankhethi was a significant naval power in the eastern coastal reach. Then there were storms. Then there was a treaty that went wrong. Then there were decades of careful, quiet management that kept things from becoming worse, while the great houses did great house things and everyone forgot that we existed. She paused. I grew up being forgotten. I learned to find it useful. The fourth house hasn't forgotten you anymore, I said. No. She turned the red leaf over in her hands again. Neither have the 7th, the 11th, or the 2nd, based on the indirect inquiries my aide has noted in the last 3 days. I looked at her. That's going to change things after this conclave. Yes, she said. I think it will. Is that, I tried to figure out how to ask this. Is that what you wanted? When you started, when you first sat down to read that survey 3 days before the conclave started, was that what you were working toward? She thought about this with the careful seriousness she brought to everything. I wanted the work to matter, she said finally. I did not particularly care whether anyone knew it was my work that mattered, but, she set the leaf down again, I think I had also begun to believe that it never would. That I would read the surveys, prepare the briefs, find the foundations no one had checked, and it would be useful and unseen forever, and I had made my peace with that. And now I think I made my peace too early. The secondary eyelids flickered. The human attaché who arrived 6 hours late and read an old geological survey because someone under a tree suggested it. That was not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who would look through me, she said. Everyone else does. I didn't have a good answer to that. I also didn't think she needed one. We sat under the tree for a while, and the wind moved through the leaves, and more red ones released and fell in slow spirals, letting go of branches to make room for what would come next. The closing session of the conclave was on the 14th day, 3 days past the original schedule. The 7th-11th mineral rights dispute was resolved using the mediation framework. The territorial question was settled using the 40-year precedent. The resource-sharing formula was corrected. 2 additional issues, a long-standing trade route classification dispute and a water rights question on an orbital body that had been technically in dispute for 60 years and functionally ignored, were surfaced, documented, and added to the formal record for action. The chairman read into the formal record, near the close, an acknowledgement that several significant contributions to the conclave's successful outcome had come from documentation submitted by the 23rd House delegation. This was unusual. Formal record acknowledgments of minor House contributions were not standard practice. I learned later from my liaison, who had been keeping better track of the political currents than I had, that the 4th House had requested it. Sira was at the table for the closing session. Not in the second gallery, not at the observer's margin at the table, in the 23rd House's designated chair, because the protocol required all recognized delegations to be present at the formal close. She sat very straight. She wore the same working clothes she'd worn all week. Her hair was still loose. When the chairman read the acknowledgement, several senior House representatives turned to look at the 23rd House's position at the table. Some of them had clearly just remembered it existed. Some of them, I thought, were looking differently than they had a week before. Sira's expression didn't change. She was, I noticed, still taking notes on a small card. After the session, in the dispersal of the formal close, all the handshakes and sigil touches and carefully worded parting phrases that are the grammar of this kind of gathering, I found her one more time near the tree. The afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the canopy. Every leaf that had turned red was catching it, and the ones that had released and lay on the ground around the roots were catching it, and the whole space under the branches had a quality of light I'd never seen before, warm and diffuse and slightly saturated, like the air itself was briefly the color of things letting go well. The 4th House's senior representative asked my liaison if the 23rd House would consider a formal consultation arrangement, I said, starting after the conclave. I know, she said. He asked me directly this morning before the close. And she looked up into the canopy. A red leaf released, turned once, twice, and landed soundlessly on the route beside the one that had been there for 3 days. And I told him I would read the proposed terms carefully before agreeing to anything, she said. Of course you would. And that any consultation arrangement would need to preserve the independence of the 23rd House's analysis, that we would not be a research department for any house's predetermined conclusions, that the value of what we do is precisely that we do not have a position to defend. What did he say? He said he had expected something like that. Another pause. He said it was refreshing. I thought about that, about what it meant, in rooms like the ones we just spent 2 weeks in, to have someone say that clear conditions were refreshing. I'm leaving tomorrow, I said. Transit window. I know. She was quiet for a moment. The 7th House has indicated they may seek observer status at a human colonial administrative meeting. The 2nd House is interested in trade route discussions. 3 other houses have noted the human delegation's presence at this conclave and have asked questions. My government is going to be very confused about what I've accomplished, I said. What have you accomplished? I thought about it honestly. I walked through some doors, I said, that were already there, that were standing open. I just didn't have enough to lose to hesitate. She turned her head and looked at me, and I had the feeling that she was choosing carefully what to say next, with the same care she brought to a geological survey or a classification index. There was a tree in the village where my family's house is, she said. Not this one, a smaller one, same species but younger, less established. When I was very small, I thought it was the whole world, the whole sky, because standing under it, the canopy was everything you could see above you. I used to sit under it and read. For a long time it was the only place I felt like what I knew mattered, even if no one else was there to see it matter. And now, I said. Now I think, she said slowly, that the tree was teaching me something I didn't understand then. That the work of knowing things, real things, checked things, foundations, takes time and patience, and it happens mostly when no one is watching, and it does not need to be loud. But also, she paused, that the shade only exists because the tree grew, that all the years of growing in relative quiet made it possible for the shade to be here now. That quiet preparation is not the same as permanent invisibility. She reached down and picked up one of the fallen leaves from the ground, fully red, brick-colored, letting go of its green entirely. My family name, she said, in old dialect means holding pattern, the pattern that water holds before it finds its course. She held the leaf for a moment, then set it back down gently. I think it is time to find the course. I didn't say anything. I didn't have the right words and I knew it, so I didn't try to find the wrong ones. We stood under the tree for a while longer. The compound lights began their shift from afternoon to evening. The falling leaves accumulated around the roots in slow increments, each one a small completion, each one making room for something new. 7 months later, in a small conference room on humanity's first and only colonial station, I sat across a table from the 4th House's trade liaison, 2 2nd House commercial representatives, and an observer from the 7th House who was there to see how things went. The discussion was about transit corridor access, which sounds simple and is not, because nothing in interstellar commerce is simple, and anyone who tells you otherwise is trying to sell you a transit corridor. About 2 hours in, the 2nd House representative produced a proposed formula for calculating shared maintenance costs that had, unless I was misreading the unit conversion, an error in it. Not a deliberate one. A transcription error, the kind that happens when you're working fast and the numbers are big. I asked a clarifying question. The representative checked the formula, found the error. The discussion paused for 40 minutes while they recalculated. When we resumed, one of the 2nd House representatives looked across the table at me with an expression that I recognized now. I'd seen it on the 4th House senior representative's face, in a side corridor, 7 months ago. The human delegation, she said, appears to read the foundational documents. I have a good source, I said. That evening I sent Siraval and Kethy a brief message. The transit time meant it would reach her in about 6 hours. I told her the formula error had been caught, the discussion was proceeding well, and that I had a question about an orbital rights framework I'd found in a pre-conclave archive that seemed relevant to something coming up in 2 months, if she had time to look at it. Her reply came back in 4 hours, not 6. She'd been awake, apparently, or she'd been waiting. The message said, I already looked at that framework. It has a methodological flaw in Section 4. I've prepared a brief. I'll send it with the next packet. And then, at the very end, something that wasn't in her briefing document register at all. Something that felt like it had been written after a long pause, then sent before she could decide not to. She said, there are new leaves on the tree. I still have the red leaf, the one from the route between us on the 7th day. I pressed it between 2 sheets of documentation during transit, and it dried flat and kept its color, that deep copper red of something that's found its season and let go clean. I carry it in the same pocket as my diplomatic credentials. Occasionally, when I'm in a room full of people who are very important and very certain that they already know what the foundations are, I put my hand in my pocket and touch it. It doesn't remind me to be careful. It reminds me to look. The galaxy is full of people who want to be the loudest, the largest, the most formally sigiled. The ones who arrange the seating charts and control the agenda and move through rooms like they built the room around themselves. And sometimes those people are right, and sometimes they are wrong, and the question of which one they are at any given moment depends on whether someone somewhere has read the survey. In my experience, and I have more of it now, though I still manage to arrive late occasionally, and my government is still confused about what I'm doing, the person who has read the survey is usually sitting somewhere quiet, not in the center of the room, not at the high table, somewhere at the margin or outside the margin entirely, where the light is good and the noise is less, doing the work that makes everything else possible. Under a tree, probably reading.